Approximately 2 years ago, I did a video explaining the meaning behind the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour film. And down in the comments, I got various people requesting that now I'd decoded Mystery Tour, I should attempt Yellow Submarine. Now I'd never seen it before, so I ordered this, sat down one morning, and watched the whole thing from start to finish. Yellow Submarine is a mad psychedelic whirlwind of nightmarish images and kitsch cartoon figures that I felt had something in common with the pink elephants on parade from Dumbo. The first time I watched it through, my overriding feeling was, bloody hell, what on earth was that? But when I drummed up the courage to watch it again, I started noticing things. Familiar themes, concepts and ideas from other Beatles creations of that era. As I watched it through the second time, the whole film, the whole shape of it, the symbolism being used and the underlying message seemed eerily familiar, although at first I just couldn't pin down why. There was, however, one blatantly obvious connection that I could just make straight away. The film is pretty much just wall-to-wall, psychedelic, acid-inspired imagery, just like Sgt. Pepper and just like Magical Mystery Tour. But what does it all mean? The first step to answering that question is establishing the context in which the film was made. Now, the period in which the Beatles made their most psychedelic work was, naturally, the acid period, which starts around the album Revolver and finishes more or less with the arrival of the White Album, at which point they had sworn off LSD, publicly at least. Everything they made within that period, however, was completely awash with the inspiration and the influence of the psychedelic drug. The Beatles' LSD era began when John Lennon and George Harrison had their drinks spiked with it by a dentist in London in April 1965. Paul McCartney became the last Beatle to try LSD in December of that same year, and initially at least it was just a wild new drug. 4 months later, however, led by John Lennon, the Beatles' experience of LSD would start to take on some new religious overtones. Because a full year after his first acid trip, on April 1st, 1966, John Lennon went into the Indica bookshop in London and picked up a book called The Psychedelic Experience by Timothy Leary. He read the book and was fascinated by what he found. Leary explained that a guided acid trip was in fact a pathway to enlightenment, a way to encounter the divine and come back to your body after the trip changed, reincarnated, with a new personality of your own choosing. He called this process ego death, and shortly after buying the book, John Lennon decided to give it a go. We know this happened between April 1st, 1966 and April 5th, because on April 6th, the Beatles recorded Tomorrow Never Knows, a 7-verse song, each verse a paraphrase of each of the 7 stages in Timothy Leary's book. It was the first track recorded for their next album, Revolver, which Lennon described as an acid album, their first one in fact. And at this point, John, who had now been converted to Timothy Leary's ritual, took on the role of psychedelic guru to Paul and the others. And soon enough, all of them, Paul included, were converted. As the Beatles took acid and followed the steps outlined in Leary's book, they began to believe that they had literally found the key to saving the world. They each felt transformed and changed into a better, more peaceful person as a result of their experiences with acid. And they began to believe that humanity as a whole could also be changed by it in the same way. Listen to this quote from Paul right in the middle of the acid era. "After I took LSD, it opened my eyes. We only use 1/10 of our brain. Just think what we could accomplish if we could tap that hidden part. It would mean a whole new world. If the politicians would take LSD, there wouldn't be any more war, or poverty, or famine." And so, really, from April 1966, the Beatles' LSD evangelist era began. Of course, it is just my opinion, but I believe that in this time, they were looking for ways to preach this new gospel to which they had been converted. The Beatles had found themselves both with an unbelievable reach and influence over world culture, and they also believed that while in that position, they had discovered the key to saving the world and bringing about a new era of peace, unity and love. But, of course, there was a problem. The establishment did not agree. In the UK, LSD was illegal. They couldn't just come out and preach it, so if they wanted to talk about what they perceived as the drug's transformative qualities, they had to do so carefully, in symbolism and code. Look at songs like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which is blatantly all about acid imagery. At the time, they had to constantly deny it and hope that the message got through, and Paul McCartney confirmed in later years it was all about LSD. You can also look at the lyrics to the song Magical Mystery Tour. It's rammed with coded references to drugs. What would you have done in their shoes if you believed you had found the key to saving the whole world, but you couldn't just come out and preach it openly? It's my theory, at least, that the Beatles' solution was to encode the message into their music in a plausibly deniable way. But what has all this got to do with the Yellow Submarine movie? Well, having watched it through a couple of times and noted some very, very similar symbolism and imagery, I decided to do a bit of digging to see, was this also made during their LSD evangelist era? Here's what I found in the Blu-ray booklet. Although the project went from initial designs to its London premiere in less than a year, the entire process took nearly 2 years. The actual drawing, painting and animating of the film took 11 months and did start in August '67, but the scripting started a full year before. Approximately July 1966, smack bang in the middle of the LSD could save the world phase. So that was the first piece of the puzzle in place. The next thing I had to address was, were the Beatles actually involved at all in the writing of the film? Many articles and books say things like this: apart from composing and performing the songs, the real Beatles' only participation was in the closing scene of the film. The voices of their animated counterparts were provided by voice actors. And as a result, most people think that they actually just weren't involved at all, which isn't true. They weren't involved in the actual animation or the voices, but they were heavily involved in the writing of the scripts, which, if you remember, were all written in the LSD evangelist era. Here's a quote from American producer Al Brodax on the 14th of June 1967. "The Beatles are very, very enthusiastic about the new animated film Yellow Submarine. They've been calling us at all times with ideas. We have even had discussions at 2 o'clock in the morning. Their suggestions are very good, and so far, all the Beatles' ideas are being incorporated into the movie." So the Beatles were definitely involved. And did you see what he said there? Every single time the Beatles phoned up with an idea, they incorporated it into the movie. Which probably explains why the script went through 14 to 20 different drafts, depending on who you ask. In fact, chief acid evangelist himself, John Lennon, literally claims credit for half the content of the script. And he says that the writers would even seek them out when they were in the studio to get more ideas and input, saying, "You know what Al Brodax used to do? Brodax got half the Yellow Submarine out of my mouth. You know the idea for the Hoover, the machine that sucks people up? All those were my ideas. They used to come to the studio and sort of chat. 'Hi John, old bean, got any ideas for the film?' And I'd just spout out all this stuff, and they went off and did it." And later, Lennon would go on to say that it wasn't just half the ideas in the film that came from them, but all the ideas. In the Blu-ray booklet it says, "It was a curiosity that this film went into production without a final script and without a final storyboard." That's probably because they would change it every time a Beatle chipped in. They probably left it open to leave space for more contributions. But it wasn't just the Beatles who were immersing themselves in the drug-soaked hippie culture. All the production team were as well. This is an abridged quote from producer John Coates, taken from the Blu-ray audio commentary. "A lot of people have said it was a psychedelic trip and that we were all on drugs. But it wasn't heavily, or we would never have got the film made. There was smoking going on. In the making of Yellow Submarine, we counted 13 children that were born as a result of that whole scene. There were lots of parties. Everyone was having parties. London was incredibly inexpensive and fun. The baddies in the film are called the Blue Meanies, and in later interviews, John Lennon told us precisely who they are meant to be as well. This is a John Lennon quote taken from his official Facebook page. Establishment, it's just a name for evil. The monster doesn't care. The Blue Meanies are insane. The only thing they can't control is the mind, and we have to fight for sanity and peace on that level. And that's what they were doing in the LSD evangelist era. It's all about reaching people's minds. It's all about the battleground of the mind. Hence the repeated refrain in the film, it's all in the mind.
It's all in the mind, you know.
John also confirms this idea about the establishment in another interview where he makes it clear that the Blue Meanies are also politicians. It's no coincidence that the Blue Meanie troops are top hat wearing men in long overcoats and other images reminiscent of the London establishment. And the film is full of comparable, meaningful symbolism all throughout. Look at the hand signals John and Paul are making in this promotional photograph. We get the OK sign on the left and the horns sign on the right, both of which do have different meanings in different cultures. But in the light of the 1960s occult revival, I reckon they probably mean this. Paul's circle probably represents secret knowledge or gnosis and enlightenment. And John's horns didn't come to mean rock on until Ronnie James Dio more than a decade later. At this point they were actually more associated with something called the Karana Mudra, which is a sign for banishing evil and commanding forces. Here's the cartoon version of John making the same sign in the Yellow Submarine promotional materials. And in fact, all the Beatles actually make it constantly all the way throughout the film. Their hands seem to fall into that little sign by default all the way through. But why do even their cartoon avatars have a default hand signal that's meant to ward off evil? Perhaps it was in the hope that the true message they were trying to convey would get through. But what was the message? As we've already seen, Timothy Leary's book taught that power came through combining ancient occult wisdom with psychedelics. And now look at that little moment I showed earlier. It doesn't take Alan Turing to make sense of it, does it? It's just absolutely bloody transparent. We've got a petrol pump representing power. We've got a pyramid, one of the best known and most recognisable symbols of ancient occult wisdom. And we've got a psychedelic tie representing the psychedelic drugs. Power comes from mixing ancient occult wisdom with psychedelics. Timothy Leary once again. Perhaps the biggest piece of symbolism, however, was the Yellow Submarine itself. Was this a drug metaphor? It is at least possible. Let's take a quick look at what Paul McCartney said at the time about his writing style and how he was filling all his songs in this era with double meanings about drugs. Roll Up was a reference to rolling a joint. We were always sticking those little things in that we knew our friends would get. Veiled references to drugs and to trips. Magical Mystery Tour is waiting to take you away, so that's a kind of drug. It's dying to take you away, so that's a Tibetan Book of the Dead reference. Magical Mystery Tour was the equivalent of a drug trip, and we made the film based on that. And Yellow Submarine, written in the same era, was believed to be yet another double entendre for drugs. While the official party line was that it was actually named after a Greek sweet, apparently Yellow Submarine was already a nickname for a psychoactive drug that had been doing the rounds in celebrity circles at the time. So, by now, you would have realised that I personally believe the Yellow Submarine film is just blatantly, obviously, about hallucinogenic drugs, as is just apparent on a first viewing. But there's more to it than that, because as I re-watched it and started making notes, I made a startling realisation. On closer inspection, Yellow Submarine seemed to follow the exact same structure and layout as Magical Mystery Tour, just remade for kids. Bit by bit, I started recognising all the parallels, and it occurred to me that they had both used exactly the same source material. And as we've already seen from that Paul McCartney quote, that source material was Timothy Leary's book. The song Tomorrow Never Knows was based on those 7 stages. The film Magical Mystery Tour was also based on those 7 stages, and as I started realising that Yellow Submarine just looked like a cartoonified, kiddified version of the Magical Mystery Tour, I began wondering if that was based on Leary's book as well. As I looked, it began dawning on me that everything made in that era seemed to have Timothy Leary's ritual running through it like a stick of rock. For example, Magical Mystery Tour starts with Ringo in a bad mood stalking the streets of Liverpool. And look at what happens at the start of Yellow Submarine. Ringo, feeling sad and depressed, once again out on the streets of Liverpool. In the Magical Mystery Tour, there's a yellow mystery tour bus waiting to take you away. And in Yellow Submarine, there is another yellow vehicle, the Sub. And the parallels don't stop there. You could sit down at a desk with Leary's book open on the left, Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine on the right, and you could then move stage by stage through the book, pointing out everything that occurs in the Beatles stuff. Now, as it happens, I've already done large features digging into Sgt. Pepper's, Magical Mystery Tour and Tomorrow Never Knows. So if you want to know more, the links are down in the description. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to work through those 7 stages of Timothy Leary's book. I'm going to show you where they connect to Tomorrow Never Knows. I'm going to show you where they connect to Magical Mystery Tour. And then I'm going to point out where they also connect in Yellow Submarine. And while they don't all highlight the exact same sentence from every chapter in Leary's book, they do all still, nonetheless, draw from all 7 chapters in that order. So now, briefly over to me from a couple of years ago. According to the book, the first thing someone undergoing the ritual has to do is to take what are today illegal psychedelic drugs. The book recommends various dosages with timings, saying how long before the session they should be taken on an empty stomach. Please don't do this in real life. So, when the steps of the actual ritual itself begin, the drug should be starting to take hold. Verse 1 of Tomorrow Never Knows is about those first effects and how you should respond to them. Turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. And as we've already seen, that is taken directly from the introduction to the book. So, phase 1 is taking the LSD, and in Magical Mystery Tour, this is represented by getting on the bus. The use of a psychedelic, brightly painted bus is largely believed to have come from an American leader in the hippie movement called Ken Kesey and a group of hippies called the Merry Band of Pranksters. This is the original Magical Mystery Bus, which a few years earlier, in 1964, had ferried a group of drug-taking hippies all over America in an attempt to make a road movie. The whole thing, however, was just an exercise in drug-fueled chaos, and Kesey's edit of the film was never completed or released. And when the bus would stop on its drives across the states, stoned hippies would wander off and not return, resulting in the famous quote from Kesey, "You're either on the bus or off the bus." And by the time of Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, the whole idea of being on the bus had entered popular culture as a reference to being part of the hippie movement. It kind of meant being on the drugs and peace and love bandwagon. And a few years after the Merry Band of Pranksters, here we have the Beatles with their own brightly coloured bus, making a film about a drug trip and inviting people to join them. While the origins of this symbolism are a bit obscure today, a bit more of a footnote in the history books, back then nobody would have missed that reference. This first section of the script corresponds to the introductory chapter of the psychedelic experience, which says, "You are now about to begin a great adventure, the journey out of your mind." And in Yellow Submarine, as we've already seen, the parallel is getting on the sub, which is bus, backwards. Phase 2 is when the drugs start to take hold, and it tells you what you should first encounter. Verse 1 corresponds directly to the intro. Now on to verse 2, which corresponds directly to the first chapter of the book. Verse 2 and the first chapter of the book discuss encountering something that the book calls the clear light, or the void. Lennon sings, "Lay down all thoughts, surrender to the void." And here is the line he used from the book for this verse. It uses very, very jargon-heavy language, but if you look at this sentence, it's saying, "Liberate your nervous system from all mental activity," meaning lay down all thoughts.
and realise the voidness. Surrender to the void.
And when you look at what Leary's book says you should encounter when you surrender to the void, we get this. Top of a list of commonly reported physical sensations, sinking down into the water. And of course, the Yellow Submarine does just this, sinking down into the water to travel the 80,000 leagues under the sea back to Pepperland. And of course, it passes straight into a black void, in which, for some reason, there are bubbles showing one of the animators in a bowler hat. Now on to Phase 3. According to Leary, this is where your old personality dies, this is ego death, and this is where you become like a little child.
Interestingly, Timothy Leary's book states at this point, just as an infant must wake up and learn from experience the nature of the world, so a person must wake up in this new brilliant world and become familiar with its own peculiar conditions. So, as you by now probably expect, it still all lines up with the book. The bus has made its first stop at an army recruiting base. It's also interesting to see that it says, God save the king on the wall, rather than the Queen, who was actually on the throne at the time of making that film.
They have gone back in time. The next place the Yellow Submarine goes is the Sea of Time, where the Beatles go back in time. Just like Leary said, they become little children too. Next, we move on to Phase 4, which is where you encounter a peaceful being and new knowledge. And in Yellow Submarine, they encounter a peaceful, magical being, a seemingly all-knowing creature, called Professor Jeremy Hilary Boob. The book tells us we might expect to see a dazzling display of dramatic creativity. The name Jeremy means God will uplift, and the name Hilary literally means cheerful, glad, or merry. This is the encounter with the peaceful deity. Next, we enter Phase 5. In Magical Mystery Tour, this is where the notorious Jesse's Nightmare scene occurs.
Now, at this point in this section, which I'm going to accurately just call Section 5, we have crossed the threshold into the notoriously weird and darkest inner sanctum of this movie, which, as always, lines up with Timothy Leary's book in sequential chronological order. This is where, having encountered a being of love previously, we now enter the nightmare phase, where you expect fearful and unpleasant encounters. John Lennon famously plays a waiter in this scene, in which he constantly shovels mound after mound of spaghetti onto Aunt Jessie's plate. It's a very strange and disturbing scene, and one that apparently came from a dream that John had just had. I don't know this, but probably while he was on acid himself. Jessie keeps eating and eating, while John shovels endless spaghetti, and Buster keeps passing over clean napkins that end up in the mass of spaghetti.
And of course, in Yellow Submarine, this is the point in the story at which we encounter Pepperland, dead and drained of colour. The frozen, lifeless figures can only weep as the minions of the Blue Meanies, the establishment, continue to torment them. In the context of a kids' film, this is the wrathful deities. This is the nightmare scenario. But now we move on to Phase 6, which is where you begin to clothe yourself with your new chosen personality.
Lennon sings, "But listen to the colour of your dream." In this phase, according to the religion, the person's personality has now encountered various different incarnations of the Buddha and is ready to come back as something new. And in the next chapter of the book, called Third Bardo, Period of Re-Entry, the book talks about this as the beginning of personality reincarnation. It lists 7 different types of possible personality reincarnation, and each one has their own colour. The world of saints, or devas, is said to shine with a white light and to be preceded by visions of delightful temples and jewelled mansions. The world of heroes has a green light and is signalled by magical forests and fire images. The ordinary human world has a yellow light. Animal existence is foreshadowed by a blue light and images of caves and deep holes in the earth. The world of neurotics, or unsatisfied spirits, has a red light and visions of desolate plains and forest wastes. The hell world emits a smoke-coloured light and is preceded by sounds of wailing, visions of gloomy lands, black and white houses and black roads along which you have to travel. So, according to this mystical ritual, You are now getting your new personality, and you know which type it is by its colour. Listen to the colour of your dreams.
In Magical Mystery Tour, we have the song Death Cab for Cutie. This is the point in the movie where Paul, the cute one, figuratively dies. Of course, you can't put something like a song about death in a strip club in a kids' movie. So instead, you have the Beatles taking on their new personalities by choosing costumes and becoming the characters from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by choice, and clothing themselves with their new personas. And finally, we come to the last one, Phase 7, the conclusion and a new personality, Reincarnation.
We are now into Section 7, the last one, which opens with the song Your Mother Should Know. The Beatles are all standing on a winding staircase in white suits, wearing carnations. Ringo, George and John are wearing red carnations, while Paul's is black. A woman comes up and presents Paul with a bouquet of flowers, which he takes, and begins dancing separately to the other Beatles. Now, this scene is often interpreted by people who are into the Paul is dead conspiracy as being a kind of funeral scene. And I actually think they're right. I think they've got the imagery correct, but the meaning wrong. Paul wearing a black carnation is symbolic. Him being given a bouquet of flowers is symbolic. But the real life Paul wasn't dead. It's about metaphorical death. It's about death and then reincarnation. All of this takes place in a part of the Tibetan ritual called the Third Bardo. And interestingly, in this section in the book, we have Timothy Leary saying, "You may think, I am dead, what shall I do?" The 7 stages of the guided LSD trip have now been completed, and the voyagers are ready to be reborn, reincarnated into new personality. And just as if to confirm this, why are they all wearing carnations? Carnation, reincarnation. More wordplay.
And if you're still in any doubt that Yellow Submarine is just Magical Mystery Tour remade for kids, here's how that film ends. Our peaceful deity, Jeremy Hillary Boob, casts a spell on the Chief Blue Meanie, and the body of the greatest enemy in the film suddenly blooms with, you guessed it, carnations again. This cartoon is, literally from the moment we see Ringo on the streets of Liverpool, and then climbing aboard a yellow vehicle in both movies, right through to that final moment of reincarnation represented by the flower, a carnation, exactly the same story and the same symbolism, just being told for 2 different audiences. In Magical Mystery Tour, during Jessie's nightmare, she actually makes peace with the symbolic enemies in that scene. Yellow Submarine concludes with the same thing happening again. The Beatles and the inhabitants of Pepperland overcome the Blue Meanies with music and love, and then invite the Blue Meanies to join them as friends, and they all make peace together as one. The Chief Blue Meanie finally accepts and takes on the new title of Your Newness instead of Your Blueness. And he is then, while covered in these carnations, immediately changed and reborn. And in his new reincarnated form, a tree grows out of his head, in which now lives the Blue Bird of Happiness. And that really sums up the message and the meaning of the whole thing. Join us on one of these trips, and anyone, even the evil establishment themselves, can be transformed, reincarnated and reborn into beings of peace. And then, of course, the film finishes with the real Beatles saying that the real Blue Meanies out in the real world can also be defeated, with the message of the Beatles' music. And in the final credits, this is broadcast in all different languages, showing that this is a message meant for the entire world. While I find it pretty much completely mental, I still find the stuff made in the Beatles' LSD evangelist era oddly charming. There was an album for everyone which carried the coded message. There was a movie for adults that also carried the coded message. And then there was a cartoon for kids as well, which carried exactly the same message again. If everyone takes LSD and undertakes this guided ritual, the world will enter a new era of peace, prosperity and happiness. These 3 Beatle works are a trilogy. They are like their LSD manifesto to see the whole world reincarnated and born anew. And Paul McCartney said in an interview later on that in the 60s, while taking drugs, he believed that he had found the meaning of life, and it contained 7 stages.
I had a mystical experience once at a party with Bob Dylan. I felt like I'm walking around and I'm going round and gradually going up a spiral walkway and get to the top and I go, I've got it. And I say to our roadie, Mal, I said, Mal, I've got to write this down and you keep this. So I wrote something down. I said, now you keep this and show it me in the morning. Don't lose it. This is the meaning. This is the meaning of life. In the morning, he shows me it. It said, there are 7 levels.
But of course, life is rarely so simple, and the LSD manifesto failed. Because however innocent and well-intentioned it was also really naive and highly dangerous. Lennon would say this later on about what those LSD trips actually did to him in the long term. LSD, I must have had 1,000 trips. I just used to eat it all the time. I stopped taking it because of bad trips. I just couldn't stand it. I dropped it for I don't know how long, and I started taking it again just before I met Yoko. I got a message on acid that you should destroy your ego, and I did. I was reading that stupid book of Leary's, The Psychedelic Experience, all that shit. We were going through the whole game that everybody went through, and I destroyed myself. I destroyed my ego, and I didn't believe I could do anything, and I let people do and say what they wanted. And I was nothing. I was shit. Even though Lennon would later swear off LSD, that was later when the dream was over. Despite having renounced LSD to the press, he actually remained in touch with Timothy Leary all through the 60s, and Lennon's song Come Together, right at the very end on the final Beatles album recorded several years later, was actually originally written as a campaign song for Timothy Leary to try and get him into a position of high office in the States, the governor of California. And I personally can't help but see that as being a step they were trying to take in the LSD master plan. Imagine a world in which Leary and the Beatles had succeeded. Imagine a world in which they never met the Maharishi, they never renounced acid, and Leary got elected and then went on to become president. Imagine what the world would have been like if they had actually succeeded and had been able to put their psychedelic drug-fueled vision for world peace into action. Someone really should make a film about a parallel universe where they succeeded and Leary became president. All the leaders of the world tripping on LSD in the world's water supply. I'd go watch that. The president having a bad trip and then pressing the big red button. You could call it Acid Armageddon. Or you could name it after a Beatles song. The End leaps immediately to mind. And of course, with that said, this is also the end. A big thank you to everybody who requested this video. I really enjoyed researching it and putting it together, even if it did turn out to just be Timothy Leary again. In this video, to avoid excessively repeating myself, I've only really skimmed the surface of the connections between Timothy Leary and the Beatles. If you'd like to know more, go check out my video on Tomorrow Never Knows, and also the ones on Sgt. Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour. Let me know your thoughts, any questions you might have, and any other future videos you might like to see down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time. And as always, a massive thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. If you would like to be credited at the end of videos, if you would like access to exclusive bonus content, and to my ad-free archive, the link is in the description, and hopefully I'll see you inside.